Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going back in time, back to 2014, to follow Alibaba as they get ready to go public, like onto the world's biggest financial stage.
Yeah.
Get ready for a wild ride, because their IPO wasn't just about the numbers, and those were massive. It was about navigating this totally unique path, filled with challenges and some really unconventional choices.
What's fascinating about Alibaba's IPO is that it wasn't just the biggest U.S. IPO ever at the time, but it really kind of exposed the friction points between Chinese regulations, global investors, and this ambitious company trying to make its mark.
Okay, so we're diving deep today with this Harvard Business School case study. And believe me, this is one for the history books. But before we get to all that IPO drama, let's set the stage. I mean, most people know Alibaba as this e-commerce titan. But back in 2014, they were this intriguing mix of explosive growth and some corporate governance choices that raised a few eyebrows, to say the least. So where do we even begin to unpack all of this?
Well, let's rewind all the way back to 1999. Picture Jack Ma's apartment in Hangzhou, China. Small space, handful of people, and the seed of an idea. That would become this global giant. It's a classic startup story, but with this uniquely Chinese twist.
From humble beginnings to a global powerhouse, I know that they focused on solving a big problem early on, building trust in online marketplaces. I mean, back then, the idea of handing your money to a stranger online was pretty sketchy, especially in China, where e-commerce was brand new. So how'd they crack that nut?
That's where Alibaba's ingenuity shines through. They understood that trust was everything, and they came up with some truly game-changing solutions. Their biggest innovation, Alipay. Think of it like an escrow service that acts as a neutral third party in every transaction.
Alipay is so brilliant, it gave buyers the confidence that they wouldn't get ripped off, and sellers the assurance of getting paid. It basically paved the way for e-commerce to explode in China.
And explode it did. By 2013, their consumer platform Taobao had 500 million registered users. That's 500 million people visiting the site 60 million times every single day, buying 48,000 items every minute.
Hold on, 38,000 items sold every minute. That's insane. It's like an entire city doing its shopping online, all through one company.
It's mind-blowing, and their approach was totally different from Amazon or eBay. Alibaba didn't actually own any of the merchandise. They focused on creating the platform, connecting buyers and sellers, making those transactions as smooth as possible.
So they were like the landlord of this giant online mall. They don't sell the products, but they make sure the shop's running smoothly. And take a percentage of the sales.
Exactly. They provided the space, the infrastructure, the tools, and charged merchants for things like advertising or prime placement in search results. But this brings us to a pivotal moment, something called the Alipay dilemma. In 2011, Jack Ma spun Alipay off into a separate company under his control, which didn't sit well with Yahoo, a major stakeholder in Alibaba at the time.
Wait, why would he do that? Was it like some power play? Or was it strategic?
It was more complicated than that. See, the Chinese government had strict rules about foreign ownership in certain sectors, like financial services. Alipay needed a license to operate. And with Yahoo, a U.S. company, having a big stake in Alibaba, it created this regulatory roadblock.
So Ma was caught between keeping Yahoo happy and complying with Chinese law. It's like a tough spot.
Absolutely. And he ultimately chose to comply with Chinese law. This move highlights a key tension for international companies doing business in China, balancing local regulations with the expectations of global investors. It's a dilemma many companies will face as China's economy continues to grow, but this Alipay situation also exposed a deeper issue. That would become central to Alibaba's IPO, the use of VIEs, or variable interest entities.
VIEs.
Okay.
I'm all ears.
Yeah.
Because it sounds a little complicated.
Think of VIEs as this legal workaround because foreign companies couldn't directly own certain businesses in China. They set up these complex agreements to essentially control them through contracts.
So foreign investors in Alibaba wouldn't actually own a piece of the company's Chinese operations.
That's the tricky part. They would have a claim on the profits through these contracts, but not direct ownership. This created uncertainty. For foreign investors, what if the Chinese government decided to clamp down on VIEs? What if these contracts weren't enforceable? In Chinese courts, these were big, unanswered questions hanging over Alibaba's IPO.
This is getting complicated. I had no idea Alibaba had to jump through so many hoops just to get to the starting line.
And we haven't even touched on the partnership structure that governed the company. That's a whole other can of worms. That added another layer of complexity to their IPO journey.
Okay, let's talk about this partnership structure. It sounds kind of like something straight out of secret society.
Well, it was definitely an unconventional approach.
Yeah.
And it became a major sticking point. As Alibaba explored different listing venues, this partnership was this group of Alibaba founders and senior managers, think of it like an inner circle, who had significant influence over the company's direction.
So like an exclusive club within the company calling the shots. How is that different from a typical board of directors?
Imagine a company where a small group of insiders always get to choose most of the board of directors. That's essentially how Alibaba's partnership system worked. In a typical company, the board is elected by shareholders and oversees management. With Alibaba, this partnership had the power to control the board, meaning shareholders had limited say in who was actually governing the company.
I bet investors weren't too thrilled about that.
You're right, there was pushback, especially when Alibaba initially tried to list on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. Hong Kong had the strict one share, one vote principle, meaning each share had equal voting power. This was designed to protect all shareholders and prevent anyone grouped from having too much influence.
So Hong Kong wasn't about to bend the rules, even for a giant like Alibaba.
Nope. They rejected Alibaba's proposal outright, arguing that it would set this dangerous precedent. It was a bold move by the HKEx, especially considering the potential economic benefits Alibaba's listing could have brought to Hong Kong.
Wow, talk about a clash of ideologies. Hong Kong prioritizing investor protection, and Alibaba wanting to maintain their unique system.
Exactly. And it highlights these different regulatory philosophies. Between Hong Kong and the U.S., Hong Kong takes more of a preventative approach, trying to head off potential problems. The U.S. is more reactive, relying on legal remedies after the fact. It's an important distinction to keep in mind, as we see more and more Chinese companies seeking to list on U.S. exchanges.
So Hong Kong was a no-go. Where did Alibaba turn next?
They set their sights on the U.S., knocking on the doors of both the NYSE and NASDAQ. And you know what? Both exchanges were surprisingly open to Alibaba's partnership structure.
Really? I'm shocked. Why would they be okay with something that Hong Kong rejected so strongly?
Because Alibaba qualified for the foreign private issuer exemption. This loophole allowed them to keep their unique governance model, even though it went against the grain, of typical U.S. corporate governance standards. It's fascinating how this quirk in the U.S. system allowed Alibaba to achieve what they couldn't in their own backyard.
So Alibaba got their wish, went public on the NYSE, partnership structure and all. But was everyone convinced this was a good thing?
Not at all. Some very vocal critics emerged, including corporate governance experts, like Lucian Bebchuk from Harvard Law School. He argued that this structure was too risky for public investors and could encourage insiders to put their interests ahead of shareholders.
Can you give us an example of how that might play out?
Think back to the Alipay situation. Bebchuk and others worried that the partnership with its tight control over the board could make decisions that benefited them personally, even if it wasn't in the best interest of Alibaba or its public shareholders. For example, they could strike deals with Alipay, which Jack Ma still controlled, that were great for Alipay, but not so great for Alibaba or its shareholders.
So concerns about conflicts of interest and a lack of accountability to public investors.
Exactly. It was a heated debate, even among financial analysts. Some praised Alibaba's structure for its focus on the long game and its ability to resist short-term market pressures. But others questioned whether this unconventional approach really served the interests of public shareholders.
Sounds like this classic dilemma, balancing innovation and freedom with responsibility to investors.
Absolutely. And Alibaba's story really brings that tension to the forefront.
So it sounds like Alibaba's story is far from just a simple success story. You know, they've got this incredible growth on the one hand and these lingering concerns about transparency and control on the other. Makes you wonder, did anyone come out ahead in all of this?
That's the million-dollar question. It's tricky because, depending on who you ask, you get very different answers. Some argue that the public shareholders who bought into Alibaba during the IPO ultimately benefited from the company's massive growth, even with the governance risks.
So even if they didn't have much say in how the company was run, they still made money.
Exactly. Alibaba's stock performance in those early years after the IPO was pretty impressive. But others would argue that those gains came at a cost, a lack of transparency and the potential for conflicts of interest. That could have eroded shareholder value over time.
It's like they were making money, but maybe leaving even more on the table because of this unusual setup.
That's one way to look at it. And then there's the question of Jack Ma and the partnership. They clearly maintained a significant level of control, which allowed them to drive Alibaba's growth in a way that might not have been possible with a more traditional corporate structure.
So is it ultimately a win for the founders and the partners? I mean, they got to call the shots. and build this massive company their way.
Yes. But remember that this level of control also brought intense scrutiny and criticism. Their decisions were constantly being analyzed and questioned, especially when it came to things like the Alipay spinoff and those acquisitions we talked about earlier.
So a double-edged sword. They have the power to make big moves, but also the pressure to justify those moves to a global audience that was increasingly skeptical of their approach.
That's a really good way to put it. Alibaba's story challenges us to rethink traditional notions of corporate governance. It forces us to ask, does success always have to look the same? Can unconventional structures actually be more effective in certain contexts, even if they come with risks?
It definitely makes you think about the trade-offs. Maybe in a rapidly evolving market like China, a more nimble and less transparent structure gave them an edge. But in the long run, could that lack of transparency ultimately limit their growth potential or even damage their reputation?
That's a debate that's still ongoing, and it's one that has implications, not just for Alibaba, but for other companies, particularly in emerging markets, that are trying to find their own path to global success.
So what can we as investors, consumers, and just people who are interested in how the world works, what can we take away from all this?
Alibaba's story is a reminder that there's no single blueprint for building a successful global company. It's also a powerful reminder that we need to be critical thinkers and ask tough questions, especially when it comes to corporate governance.
Because ultimately, the choices a company makes about how it's governed have this ripple effect, impacting not just shareholders and employees, but also consumers and the broader economy.
Exactly. We can't just blindly accept the status quo. We need to demand transparency, hold companies accountable, and be willing to challenge the assumptions about how things should be done.
Well, I think it's safe to say that Alibaba's journey to going public is more than just a business story. It's a story about innovation, ambition, culture, and the complexities of navigating a rapidly changing world. And as their story continues to unfold, it will be fascinating to see how these themes play out in the years to come.
I couldn't agree more. Alibaba's story raises a lot more questions than it answers, but that's part of what makes it so compelling. It's a story that challenges us to think differently about the world of business and the role that corporate governance plays in shaping the future.
And on that note, we want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on Alibaba's unconventional journey and the broader questions it raises about corporate governance? Share your insights, join the conversation, and help us all dive a little deeper into this fascinating story. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.